As we kick off the 10th season of Serenbe Stories, we're hitting a major milestone. 2024 marks 20 years from Serenbe's groundbreaking, when the very first homes were being built and Serenbe was beginning the outreach to potential residents who would make a huge leap to move to the country, taking a chance on a very new and evolving type of neighborhood development. In this episode, Steve and I take a trip down memory lane, discussing what the world looked like in 2004, the earliest days of the green building movement, and some of the major milestones that influenced Serenbe's path forward. We also discuss the way the community has evolved over the years and what the next 20 years have in store for us.
All these places that we are helping and that are coming in and looking is to understand our concepts. It isn't to copy our land plan or our architecture. A few places have tried that, I think, have failed because they thought it was about the physical. It's about the policy and the attitude. And that's the biggest thing that we're showing.
Steve, how are you today?
I'm good, Monica. So much going on.
Well, this is a pretty exciting interview because we want to roll everything all the way back to 2004 because we are in the 20th anniversary from breaking ground on Serenbe. Not from the idea of it, but from truly breaking ground. So, rewinding the clock, Steve, I want you to go back, everybody listening to us.
Memory lane.
Memory lane. George W. Bush was president. We're at the height of the Iraq War. Facebook, remember that thing, has just launched. Hey Ya by Outkast is the #1 song, which was one of my favorites. And you know what? We're still 3 years away from the first iPhone in 2004. So, such a different place. I don't know where the Prius, I know you had one of the first Priuses that rolled off. So that maybe had been out for a little bit. I think Google had just been around for a while. We were talking to somebody else about that earlier today. So tell us what you remember in 2004 when we first broke ground on Serenbe.
Isn't it amazing what a different world we live in just 20 years in happening? Things are changing fast, and then other things are not changing nearly as fast as you want. 20 years ago, you didn't talk about environmental development or environmental anything because that was the idea of straw bale houses and these earthen structures, and ugly architecture from the 70s was kind of associated with it. And so I remember we stopped talking about an environmental community. So that was really different. South Face was the leading. In fact, I think it was the only places we looked at the resources as to who was having big conferences to really addressing this, and South Face was really the only one. Now, you have to remember, the LEED was just being conceived and introduced on a very small scale. So all these things that we think about in the environmental or biophilic world were just very foreign 20 years ago.
Yeah, no, I vaguely remember going to one of the earliest U.S. green building conferences in Austin, which probably was around this time. And that was my early introduction to sort of green building. You know, The Inconvenient Truth was released in 2006, I think. Right. Is that right?
That's right. We were 2 years ahead of this.
Yeah.
And of course, Ray Anderson, my mentor who was pushing all that, he and Al Gore were friends, and everyone in that movement was friends. Then Prince Charles, King Charles now, was really one of the voices in the European realm.
And you got to go visit, right? I don't know what time period that was. You went over.
That was a few years later, but it was still in the early days. It wasn't right at groundbreaking. We visited Poundbury about this time when we were conceiving, and then it was later that King Charles invited us to Highgrove for lunch. And then around, 2010, when they did this American Leadership Conference out of the Prince's Foundation. They held that here for 2 years.
Oh, yeah, that's right. So you're breaking ground. You're trying to explain to people it's not green, it's just a community out in the woods. But let's bring it in a little bit closer. What was happening south of I-20?
South of I-20, nothing was happening. That's why we found this paradise. That's why, all this land was actually available. So I think we've talked the story before. This was really my reaction to save the land, which started really at the end of 1999. And so by the time we actually broke ground, I had been into this thought process for 4 years. So I had gone from just concerned about saving the land, then to in the search for someone who was actually doing it as a model or consultant. And Ray Anderson's the one who suddenly pushed me, not suddenly, it was gradually over, a period of time, to where I realized that I had the skills to really change the zoning on this entire area, and that was one of the solves, and that there was no one actually creating the model, and that we needed to do that. So that was a real awakening that through that, there was no one day during those 4 years, but all of a sudden, about a year out or better than that, probably almost 2 years out, I realized I was going to be the developer.
Right.
And then you start looking at what does that mean? Because initially it was just how do we save the majority of the land?
Right.
And we're going to develop 30%. This is the model, and we'll save the rest. That's where we started. But then what are the great places? And that's when we thought about arts. But then how do you fund that? And so that's when we created the Institute. So it was that period leading up to the groundbreaking that really we had all these concepts in place and we were starting to move forward.
Right. So really 2000 to 2004 was your visioning, pulling the people together, going out and finding inspiration, initially trying to find a developer to do it for you, but then coming to the realization you had to do it yourself. And then in 2004, so we went from the bulldozer moment, which a lot of people know from previous podcasts, to really 2004, breaking ground.
That's
People
right.
are moving in. And there are a lot of information in the podcast about sort of what that was like and what was going on. But high level, a lot of the things you were doing at the time, we always joke like we're illegal, right? So now we got to talk about like what's going to be legal in the future. But like, what are the things that were illegal, just some of the highlights that now are just commonplace? Or I shouldn't, they were illegal, but you really got the minds to change in policy.
Well, that's right. So they weren't allowed is a way to look at it.
Yeah.
And as I can say now, we have sanitized our zoning regulations over the last several decades to where we've actually taken the vitality out of where we live. And that was one of the things I was dealing with. So because we brought the entire community of 500 landowners together and changed the land plan and overlay, Fulton County realized that any zoning laws regarding the buildings were so out of place from what we were doing it that we just needed to rewrite it. We couldn't modify or change. It was going to be too complicated. So we were able to get things in like Live Works, because back then you couldn't have retail below residential. It's hard to believe, but
Right.
it's still not in a lot of zoning. But this was all available. I mean, this was normal pre-1930. And so many of these situations, all of our engineers talked about balanced sites. And this is because everyone was so used to grading everything flat.
Well, you still see that around.
Well, you see it everywhere.
See all the trees are gone and grading all around.
And it is the cheapest way to do it. And all the equipment from the utilities are set up, and they need these 20-foot wide swaths. And so we just then kept, at that point 20 years ago, running up against rut thinking and systems that even though we'd changed some of the laws or were able to do it, it was still a daily. And we're still doing that in other things. While it's not as much the built environment, now we're doing that in other things that we're wanting to do. You realize how really deep in rut thinking is the only thing I can think of that we've gotten into. And people are starting, I think over this 20 years, the big change is people are realizing what we've been doing hasn't worked.
Right.
20 years ago, that wasn't the case.
And then when you say rut thinking, I know you also talk about silos, that a lot of the different groups in a city planning are siloed. Now that's changing. And I think a great example that you always bring up is sort of green infrastructure. Do you want to talk about green infrastructure you chose to do here and some of the changes that you've seen over the years?
Well, absolutely. I mean, one of the large things is Bruce Ferguson has written a lot of books on stormwater. And so I thought, well, this is going to be natural. And of course, what we wanted to do and end up doing wasn't actually legal for 7 more years.
Right.
Now it's very common. You see Old Fourth Ward, the concrete ditch in LA, most college campuses. Not only did you not see it 20 years ago, it wasn't legal. And so that's one of the huge changes. But I think Old Fourth Ward Park is a good example of how you bring the Parks Department and the Stormwater departments together to really create both quality of life and an improved tax base. 20 years ago, those departments didn't always know each other.
Right.
And I believe that still exists today in some places. They're just not working together.
Well, and I think a lot of people either don't have the vision or there's a fear of doing something differently, right? We always want to know, well, how was it done before? And we should just follow that because that's going to be the easy choice versus saying, well, maybe there's a better way.
That's right.
There's a better way to do it. And I do think bringing together the parks and the stormwater is an incredible example.
It's a great example. And then these things are still going on today. So we're all very aware of the power lines that go through all of our landscapes. You see these big swaths. Wouldn't it be great if those could be paths of various ways to connecting? But there's all sorts of roadblocks.
Right.
And it's not easy. I understand that. There's agreements and property rights and all sorts of things. But that's another one that, wouldn't it be great if 20 years from now that we remember that as a antiquated thought?
Talk a little bit more about connection to nature, because I think the wastewater, obviously, it's wastewater, but it's also the water moving through a development or a neighborhood. There's a lot of conversations about daylighting that stormwater versus wastewater. So that's a little bit of the Old Fourth Ward. And you do it all throughout Serenbe. Everything, all the creeks are daylighted unless they're going underneath a specific road or a little trail. Talk about that, nationally or, where you've seen changes.
I mean, this is the big thing. I mean, we've been and still many times, and the rules were changed maybe 12 years ago to allow daylighting and bioretention in the way we're talking about it. But then connection to nature, people really became aware of that with Richard Louve's book, Last Child in the Woods. And that must be no more than 12 years ago. I can't remember the exact date, but it was considerably after we had opened because we were fairly well along when people started sending me the book or making me aware of it.
Right.
And so that made people aware of the importance of nature. Now, one thing, I was going to say simple, and it's not simple, I know, and especially in the bigger cities, but it can be done in very dense areas, is I ask many people to imagine where the raindrop that falls on your house or your office makes its way to the local tributaries and rivers. And very few people can even imagine it. They've never thought about that. Now imagine if the path of that water could turn into green corridors. And so suddenly all of our cities would be like a vein system that we understand that our bloods and our vein system is what energizes our bodies. And that's true of where we live. If we could do that, nature would be alive. And this would be corridors for birds and various animals. And it would totally change our cities. And that's just a matter of changing regulation.
Right. And we've talked a lot about the Riverlands project that you've been working on, as well as Hannah Palmer, who wrote the book about the Flint, which is under the Hartsfield Atlanta Airport.
That's right.
And she encourages everybody to find your river, find your creek, make it your own. So I think there's been a lot of people who have been inspired by seeing these infrastructure projects changing. What about the community? What about the people? What surprised you over the past 20 years with the people?
The amazing thing, I didn't think about who was going to move here. This was an effort to save the greater land. And then having such an interest in architecture, it was exciting to create the streets and the buildings and knowing programs, like arts and agriculture, those were important for a vital community. But to actually visualize or think about who might move in, it literally never dawned on me.
But you thought maybe, or at least this is the story that I hear, is it was going to be maybe, boomers, people who are empty nesters were going to come down. They might have a second home. But the number of people with kids was sort of surprising, in the sort of maybe the 5 or 6 years in.
Well, you start realizing it because those first 20 lots that were reserved, they were empty nesters. And so it was, school is not one of the things we have. So they're not going to be empty nesters. And then in that first phase, we had one family move in with school-age kids. And then in the second phase of Selborne, I remember we modeled most of the houses for the empty nesters. And they built one house for a family that, had this playroom on the top floor and all these things. Well, 2 people in their 70s bought that house, but then several people with kids started buying. And then I remember that when the Crossroads, which was kind of the third, and that's right at the entrance, and they have big porches, and we had several families move in, and they all had these big plastic play toys, and they'd leave them on the front. And I thought, oh, that looks awful. until suddenly everybody said, "Oh, you mean there's kids here?" And I realized, oh, that's the flag that this is not just old people or empty nesters. And so that was really a transition there.
Yeah. It's a different kind of life on the front porch with all the kid items. That's really funny. So the people have moved in. And so when the people have moved in, more and more businesses have moved in as well. Some people who have moved here have opened them and some others. So that's also sort of an interesting thing over the 20 years. You know, you started out with like really the Blue Eyed Daisy as the first business, if you will, right? Really thinking third space for food and table and gathering. You know, Tom Swanston had a gallery next door. There was like a little grocery store, maybe.
There was a grocery store.
I don't know if there was anything else.
And Marie and someone else, they opened a China and very much what...
Little home store.
Yeah, it was a little home store, cooking goods store, and that kind of thing. That lasted, I forget, that's where the salon is now.
Right. And there was like, I know that when we moved in 2009, there was maybe a little spa. I think it was Blue Med Spa was the original
it was Blue Med Spa. Two rooms. They had two rooms.
And now the spa is, is it 16 rooms? It's quite large, expansive.
It's at least 16 rooms.
All sorts of great stuff.
Steam room and
Yep.
sauna. And then we had where the sushi restaurant is. We had the great wine, chocolate, and an artist, and she would sit in the window and paint. They would bring in musical on the second floor, and we'd have this.
That was
great
Jane
grain club, and so.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
We need to bring that back.
Okay. Well, let's talk to Mark over at the sushi place, see what he can do.
Well, we'll keep the sushi. Somebody else can do it.
Well, and then you had incubated the Hill restaurant. You know, you guys had the farmhouse up at the inn, but then Halsa, you know, that was I think of it a more recent, but that I want to say that was like
5 years ago.
Yeah, years ago. And then we'll have Austin's coming online in 2024. So that'll be fun to stay tuned for. What other businesses sort of surprised you or was exciting? Because we have a lot of retail, but we have a lot of wellness. You know, you opened up that, you know, the buildings, you invested each of the, I would say the core commercial spaces you had invested by selling real estate in Midtown, if I'm correct, and then reinvesting down here. And so each of the cores were really you pushing the envelope because I'm sure banks were like, what, why, how, no, right? So tell us.
Well, looking back, and when you get to my age, you can really look back and realize some of these things. And I realize placemaking isn't just a word. And if you have a plan and you set the intent strong enough and follow through, people will show up that are looking for that. Midtown Atlanta is an example of that. I opened my first restaurants on the edges of there starting 50 years ago, and it was the cheapest real estate in Atlanta. And 10 years later, we set up a plan to make it a walkable community, and you look at what is today. It's one of the best values, and it's one of the most active square miles in America today. It's the same thing here. We created a place that was connected to nature, but a very urban, walkable pods. And so the arts, we stepped forward with programs and we hired artists to do our streetlights. And artists and the creatives started showing up. And so that was that they were followed. And then people wanting, following healthy food is that movement. So you had people that were conscious about the food and our soil started showing up. And the same happens with the third one. We want a community of wellness. Now you think when we started planning this 10 years ago, 11 years ago, what did that mean? There was a relationship with Mayo that developed through the Global Wellness Summit, and we really created a lot of this on one of the ski lifts in Austria. That led to a 2-year relationship, and they were going to come and do a very innovative something. But I had to build a building for them. Right. And no investors. I mean, south of I-20, an office building with a focus on wellness. What are you talking about? Are you doing medical job? And they won't do it here. So number one, no one understood what we were going to do. And number two, this location was not the place that they thought they should do it. Right. And so thank goodness, I bought a lot of land in Midtown when no one thought it was there. And so I sold a half an acre on Peachtree Street to build that building. Now, the Mayo thing fell through, but by sheetrock, we had that building mostly leased with mostly health and wellness. Today, it's 100% on well-being. from traditional medical doctors to Chinese doctors to gyms and yoga.
The dentist is in there.
And the dentist.
Physical therapy.
I mean, but the most incredible thing with that intent, there are now 16 live works. That's where individuals have bought the real estate. It has a commercial on street level and most of them 2 apartments above. And the majority are associated somewhere with health and wellness, from bamboo juice to a great Pilates, creek retreat, small animal vet.
Yep.
And so that really surprises me when I look at it
Yeah,
today. That was purely setting the intent without any rules and regulations.
Well, and I think interestingly, you have a lot of really cool niche things like the IV hydration. You've got, and a pediatrician isn't niche, but we have a pediatrician that comes in. We have cryo. We have hydrofacial, like really interesting, cool stuff that I think is leading edge on wellness and really interesting.
2 weeks ago, we had someone here from San Francisco, and she couldn't believe it. She says, I can't find a neighborhood in San Francisco that has all the things you're offering right here within walking distance.
Yeah, we talk about that maybe we don't tout it enough, that we know that they're here because we're residents, but maybe people who visit or people who are moving don't quite understand the extent of the services.
We just take it for granted.
Yeah, we do.
When we talk about this, I often think that, well, as you know, everybody thought I was crazy and all my friends in the real estate business and what have you. And then during the middle of the recession, some of those people would come to visit. And we had not one storefront empty.
Yeah.
And I'd have many people ask me, who's handling all of your leasing? Because generally communities are commercial, they have an agent. And I said, oh, we're doing it. Well, how are you getting all these people? And I thought a minute and I thought, well, I'm playing with them, but then it's kind of real. Because they thought this was nuts. And I said, well, I just think about who we need. And within a couple of weeks, they show up the Blue-Eyed Daisy. But that's kind of true.
It's half true. I mean, it really is kind of fascinating. Or we were just saying that one of the live works just went up for sale and one of our residents bought it. And so the current retailer, I think, is in there for the next year. But the woman who bought it is sort of really concepting, like, not only what does she want to do, but what do we need? And that's kind of exciting as well. So we'll see, TBD on what that's going to look like.
You look at all the instances where residents have wanted to buy for an investment and to be part of the community, and they've ended up opening shops to fill a need, a niche that we don't have.
Or a passion that they had that is either, maybe it's a hobby or it's a retirement plan or, it's a side hustle, but it's pretty exciting. Or friends of friends, right? We talk about Nigel's at Seaside is coming in, which was, a friend of a friend. And that's going to be a pretty exciting new retail shop. So you touched on food and ag. And so, farms was a big deal. In fact, there was just an article out in Pro Builder that also talked about, is agrihoods still a great way to add to a community? And it kind of made me chuckle a bit because, we've been circling this for years and really we're one of the first one. And we were in that article as one of the early ones. But talk about farm, talk about knowing your farmer, knowing where the food's coming from. As somebody who's a restaurateur and still is, obviously food was really important to you. Fresh food was really important to you, chefs and farmers and those relationships. But talk about agriculture and where you see that's come over the 20 years and some of the interesting things like Rodale that have come in since then.
If you look at our vulnerable systems today that we need to be concerned about, it is our food chain of nutritious food. I mean, there is available stuff to eat, but it's nutritious food and our soil health, and they are critical issues today. Having grown up on a farm, I realized just a quality of place was we had to grow our own food. That just seemed natural as you do it. And you sort of realized that wasn't happening anywhere. That small farm just didn't exist. In the 20 years, there's a spotlight now on the issue that so much of what is in our food chain and aware to us, especially in fast foods, has empty nutrition. And it's why we're hungry and thirsty. And for the first time in any civilization, we have obesity and malnutrition in the same body. Just think about that. That seems impossible. And so this is one of the biggest things that's, as much as climate warming, this is one thing that is just starting to be noticed. Common Ground is a new film that's just out that everyone should see. It brings focus to a lot of these issues. And we started out just to have a cool farm. And we ended up with national organizations coming to see what we were doing because it was so unique. It had gotten press. And we realized that a lot of these national organizations were dealing with our soil health and our food systems were operating in silos and didn't know one another. And so about 5-6 years ago, I hosted what I call a 24-hour dinner party, bringing all those groups together. And now we have Rodale as our northern neighbor with the whole research center. The Conservation Fund decided in Georgia that they would launch the Farm Fund, and they're working with that now, taking it to other states. But we're about to announce some exciting things where, because of our transfer development rights, this makes a lot of sense on that program. The American Farmland Trust had no one in Georgia or really addressing the Southeast, and now they have 4 people working out of Georgia. It's great to see this hub of thought leadership that's happening. When David Scott was the chairman of the House Ag Committee, he invited us to help put together a panel for testimony for the Farm Bill.
Yeah.
So by just setting out to do what seemed like a natural thing in all these areas, we're turning into a national model and a facilitator of thought leadership.
Yeah. Well, and I think that it's interesting because not only have you affected Serenbe, right, which is about 1,400 or so acres, but you've affected the larger area. Now, you set out to do that originally with the transfer development rights and the 70-30, but I think it's really interesting to see how many cool, I'll call them ag-focused businesses or farms are not only here. You know, you showed me a map the other day of all the different farms with, you know, whether that was ranchers or, you know, vegetables or trees, blueberries, but, you know, like the guys who own multiple hundreds of acres and they're doing a horse farm and there's a couple more. And now there's other communities that are coming in that have been attracted that want to sort of emulate Serenbe, which is super exciting within Chattahoochee Hills, the 40,000 acres. So tell me a little bit about that.
So I often have to smile because I think back into what prompted me to sell my company and retreat. Because I was naively wanting to make a difference. In fact, I remember when I was, you know, what was it, 30 under 30 or whatever it was, and the caption they put under my name was concerned. I never thought about that.
That's interesting.
You know, so I was always on various boards trying to make a difference, support politicians that I thought would make a difference. And it was in 94 that I felt that you really couldn't make a difference, that we were on a course, and why was I working so hard that I could be with my family on our own retreat. And that was my retreat. There was no anger there. It was just giving in to the fact that you couldn't really change the system. So it's very ironic that then 7 years later, we became a developer to save the land with no grand ideas about doing anything other than saving the land. And we brought 500 landowners together to save and put these policies on just 40,000 acres.
Right.
No thought that this would be anything other than saving the majority of the 40,000 acres with a unique idea.
Right.
And so it's really incredible now when I see the people who are moving here, and you see, Monica, the people who are moving here are changing the 40,000 acres.
Right.
It isn't just that. They're buying land, they're opening businesses. If you look at the restoration of Dunaway Gardens from 2 women who live here, the horse farms you mentioned, they all initially started out living here. The farm businesses, it's so exciting. But then it goes beyond that now. We have developers literally every week, which is why you set up the great biophilic room to where people understand what biophilic design means on a community scale.
Right.
Australia brought 16 of the developers here last fall to spend 4 days with us. The largest development group out of Utah that had 2,000 acres by Park City. So we were able to really turn around this whole development in Hyde Park that's now in the ground, and there are ribbon cuttings and things. It's really fun to see we literally globally are having a influence.
Right, which is so exciting because I think one of the things that we talk about is that, you know, and people can say that it sounds like a tagline, but, you know, if you want to change the world, you've got to start in your own backyard. But that's truly what you did. And I think trying to inspire people that they can make change, that they don't have to have this grandiose vision. They just need to start with sort of like one step at a time. It's just a branch on the tree. We don't need to deal with the forest right now.
That's right. And all these places that we are helping and that are coming in and looking is to understand our concepts. It isn't to copy our land plan or our architecture. A few places have tried that, I think, have failed because they thought it was about the physical. It's about the policy and the attitude. And that's the biggest thing that we're showing.
Yeah. Sometimes I try to explain to people, what it is. I think placemaking was not a word 20 years ago that was a common knowledge. And so I think there is a placemaking. And, we talked to somebody earlier today about social infrastructure, right? So you have physical infrastructure and you have social infrastructure. And I think you've brought the two of them together. And then you've created, if you will, like a container that then people show up in. And they want to be here because of the physical and the social, but they stay because of sort of the energy.
And it changes who they are.
Yes.
This is why our pictures never do it justice. Everyone that shows up tells me we should do a better job of capturing. You can't because it's feeling it and experiencing it.
We've tried everything, video, podcast.
And you feel the people.
Yeah.
And you realize how rare it is for people to smile at you and look into the waves and wave. And you can genuinely feel a vitality on the streets that I realize that's part of what you're seeing. And it's by the land plan where people are out. It's by the beauty that makes you feel good. And then it's the people that has attracted.
Right.
That engaged.
Yeah. Well, and I'll say another thing that, back to when you were saying you've had a lot of families showing up is that there's a full-blown school here, which is incredible. We were, when our kids were 2 and 4, we were in somebody's basement and we hired a Montessori teacher and bought all the materials, and there were 12 kids, and that's kind of how the whole thing started as conceptually, but it is a full-blown school. So that's a whole nother thing that, you could have your child at whatever, 6 weeks through 12th grade go through the school that not only is a school, but it has a physical structure. So you have all the components. So that's a totally kind of mind-blowing to me that has watched that change.
Well, 20 years ago, lack of education options was the reason this land was there. Luckily, we could send our kids to private school, Woodward. But it's so exciting today that now we have our own neighborhood school with 220 kids on a campus that's going to be built out for 450.
Right, incredible.
With vitality, and you see the kids all over doing incredible things, totally environmental. They can see how their building's performing. They're living. They're not going to have to study these things. They're living it, and it's very different. But also, we have a charter school that's a model charter school 7 miles from us that this community stood up for the greater community. We are now across the county line, and there is a top public school just 4 miles from our new area that we're building in the south side of Serenbe. And we have 2 private schools that bring buses to pick up kids here, Woodward Academy and Heritage out of Newnan. We have gone from no real education options to incredible educational options.
You really kind of have your choice of where you want to go and what you want to do. So that's a huge change in 20 years.
Huge.
Incredible. I'm sure there's a ton of stuff we could talk about, but what's next? Like, where do you see the next stage of growth for Serenbe?
We're right now unpeeling the onion on several things. Because we're having so many visitors, corporations are bringing their think tanks here. We have 2 hotels on the drawing board, and that's going to be a new day. The Selborne Hotel is going to have a lot of commercial space, so we'll have 4 more restaurants, art galleries, clothing shops. That's a next stage. We have always wanted to address senior housing or housing where you can age in place, and an entire culture where you can age in place. And I believe we talked about the kids, and I think during the pandemic, our kids didn't miss the beat. And you read all these stories, nor did our seniors. They were out on their porches, but those weren't the stories throughout the nation. And it put a spotlight on what a disservice we have to the bookends of our society, the youth and the elders, in how we've expected them to spend their days and to live as seniors. And so we're really going to change that. But again, we're against some of the rules and regulations and staffing that make this either very expensive and not very vital. So you look at the senior housing that we're getting ready to announce, it's lots of staircases. There's elevators tucked away, but it's staircases.
Right.
If you look at the blue zone, they don't have elevators. It's hills, it's stairs. If you look at places where people are vital, it's not because they pampered you as you get elder. It's because you expect you to participate.
Well, and to move.
That's
I mean,
right.
we were joking that we need, like they put beds on the floor. So getting up and down or standing to put your socks on and walking those stairs, that kind of movement, if you stop doing it,
it's crazy.
You can't move anymore.
And so many of these places, they try to emulate country clubs or fancy hotels. Heck with that. We're looking at the studies to keep your mind active at the end of life is the same as the beginning. And we're using all primary colors and bright colors and very vibrant. It's going to look so different than anyone is used to seeing any place for people to age in place. And we're not having an age restriction.
I was going to say,
So,
multi-generational.
That's very different. And you'll have available a complete menu of services to keep you vital. So it's about a well community. And so much of our system is to deal with you presuming you're sick, and it's just to fix you because of your bad lifestyle. And what we're focusing on is a better lifestyle that keeps you more vital, so you're not have to coming into these traditional systems. 80% of what we're dying from today is from lifestyle. Now, that is just appalling. And we as a nation will not be able to afford it as the baby boomers reach and move into elderhood. So this is a financial crisis that's going to come to a head.
Yeah.
And so we're again at the leadership of dealing with that. We're on drawing boards for workforce affordable housing because we came into an area that was full of affordable housing. We'll be bringing in 500 to 800 new jobs in the next 5 years, and we have used up the affordable housing. And so we're addressing that, and we're finding all of the rules and regulations, that understanding why a lot of that isn't working today. And so we continue, even 20 years later, as we do more in building out what a true vital community is, we're still running into the broken systems.
Right. You're not set to retire anytime soon. You want to assure everybody.
Why would anyone retire? Why would, I have the 30-year plan, Monica.
Yeah, I love it. No, I want to know that you're going to still, you're still doing
listen,
it.
I was just at our neighboring Baptist church that has a senior housing, and they wanted to know what we were doing there. And they were sharing with me that they have a 109-year-old lady. And until 3 years ago, she was leading the chair exercise classes.
Amazing. Yeah.
I mean, that's
the future.
It changes our attitude. And this is the future because, well, I'll tell you, the grandmothers of today, when you look at Jane Fonda and the various
Martha Stewart,
they're not the grandmothers of my day.
No. No.
And so our self-image of what elderhood looks like is very different.
That's exciting.
And that market, the baby boomers, because of their buying power, have changed systems. When we were teenagers, it changed entire systems. It will change how elders age as we move into the next 20 years.
Right. I love it. Anything else you want to add before we wrap it up today?
Oh, we're doing a lot more. I just came from a solar luncheon looking at Georgia Solar Association and what's happening there. Another place, and stay tuned. We're going to have a podcast when we're going to be able to announce some really
great,
incredible things. I mean, we're already the leader in geothermal and recognized globally for what we've done with the heat pumps, and that's quality of life as well as energy. And we're really touching into solar and maybe going to have some exciting things.
Great.
So, and transportation.
I know you want to take cars off the street eventually.
So we are changing the places that we live to make them more vital and more responsible to the issues, not just of where we live, but they're global issues that all reflect a lot of things.
All right. Well, here's to 20 years and here's to 20 more.
We'll look forward to having this chat in 20 more years.
I love it. I'll be back.
Good.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks.